Shogun episode 5 was probably my favorite episode of the season. It does a wonderful job of starting off pretty light, kind of comedic, and then just gets more and more intense as the episode goes on. And it ends at probably what I would call your false low point for the halfway mark of the season. There'll be spoilers. It's a really character focused episode, primarily on John, Buntaro, and Mariko. And really the episode centers around them, but Toranaga does come back and play a pretty big part. And even though he's not on the screen a bunch, quite a bit happens for him story-wise. So let's just get into it. So we pick up right where we left off. People were picking up leftover body parts from the cannon attack that was initiated by Nagakado at the end of last episode. And Toranaga comes back with this big-ass army. And you can see him, he's on horseback, he's got his armor on, he looks cool as shit. Here's an image just so you can see how many men he has behind him. And obviously it's a ton. They're clearly ready for all-out open war at this point. And this is the one thing I really don't like from this episode. And it was actually pointed out by somebody in the comments whenever Buntaro died off screen. And I agreed with him then. And I still agree that I do not like how this was done. I hate when people use, oh, well, they didn't die on screen to justify anyone living in any situation. Like when we left him, he was alone and surrounded by enemies. They were in Ishido's territory. So all of Ishido's men were there. They kind of just hand-waved away with, oh, well, he escaped thanks to the help of some Ronin, and only him and a couple other guys survived. And I think unless you're going to take the time to show the scene in a flashback to explain it, I just hate this decision. I think it's bad writing, and I think it's lazy. The good thing is that him coming back drastically increases the tension for the rest of the episode, because most people, myself included, are assuming that the consort that showed up for John was Mariko, even though they haven't openly said it at this point. Toranaga and Buntaro are back, and that's our introduction. So you can see we're getting off to a pretty fast start. This episode is called Chapter 5, Broken to the Fist, and this is the title I think I had the hardest time with in understanding, because Toranaga talks to his son about letting Omi trick him into starting this war and launching this attack, and he's using his falcon to hunt a pheasant, and he explains that the smart falcons find their own prey and whatever, and essentially the dumb falcons will take the lure, and he throws out a dead pheasant for the falcon and it grabs it. And he says broken to the fist. His implication seems to be that Nagakado fell for their trap and now they're in a war. Like they kind of took the bait. That's how I interpreted it. I couldn't even find anything online about the expression itself, so I don't know if it's an actual expression or maybe it's some kind of translation thing from Japanese and that's why I can't find it. But anyway, that's how I interpreted it for this one. We go to the regents who remain. They're saying that Lady Ochida, who's the mother of the heir, will be back in a couple days, and they want the city secured. They're trying to figure out who to vote in as a fifth regent. That way they can pass the impeachment of Toranaga and the execution. We saw Toranaga step down so that the four of them would have to replace him to get 5 votes so they can make a decision. And there's a nice little thing here where they each suggest somebody, but then nobody else wants to accept it because they're still doing political jockeying for position. So you can see it's going to be kind of a slow process, probably as Toranaga planned. Toranaga and Mariko are talking as they ride horseback and his falcon's hunting, and he's talking about how it took Buntaro 3 weeks to get back, 20 days. So this gives us some kind of sense of time in the show. And Mariko's saying she's never been hunting before because her husband never took her. She gives him the diary that she was keeping of everything that John was saying and doing, and Toranaga says that Buntaro and her are going to stay at his place. So they're all going to live together now, which obviously creates an awkward situation for those two, and mainly for the audience because we're assuming they slept together. And Toranaga asked Mariko if it was her son who ordered the cannon attack. And we see this for a few minutes. He's kind of poking and prodding to see who actually ordered it and figure out what's going on. Because he's not sure if Yabushige manipulated his son or if maybe Omi did. And at one point he says his son is not clever enough to do it on his own. So he obviously thinks that he's being manipulated. And it's pretty cool because he figures it out pretty much as soon as he gets back. Like he's already aware of what's going on and understands that there's more to it than his son being impulsive and just attacking. Toranaga gives a pheasant to Mariko to give to John as a token of gratitude. And then Toranaga lays into his son immediately. And he's like, did it occur to you that you might be doing Yabushige's bidding? Or maybe that nephew of his. And his son's like, Father. And he's like, you can call me Lord. Like he's very pissed off and drawing a clear line in the sand for what their relationship is now, that they're going to be formal and not like a father-son duo. And here's where he says the line, you fell for their trap so easily, broken to another man's fist, like a falcon but without the beauty. So the way that he explains it is that falcons can be launched from the fist at anything. Some will attack anything and everything. Some will be lazy and tempted by the lure, but they can all be broken. And then he says, until you can figure this out, I'm stripping your command from the cannon regiment. I guess the way that he's using broken from another man's fist is implying that he's the falcon being launched from someone else's fist because it was a trap. I don't know. Maybe I'm just an idiot and someone in the comments can explain it to me. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time grasping this one. We see that Ishido got the head of Jozen, and this is pretty much his complete preamble to openly go to war and get rid of Toranaga. So we get a part here that seems pretty funny when you first see it and don't know what's going to happen, where John gets the pheasant from Toranaga and hangs it up to sit outside, and they're all like, isn't it going to rot? He's like, yes, but nobody touch it. It's forbidden. If anybody touches it, they die. It's partially because he can't communicate what he's trying to say, and then this has a really big impact later on. You can see how broken his Japanese is, that he just says, if touched, die. And all the helpers are kind of freaking out because they're like, it's going to rot, and they're really concerned about omens and being cleanly and that sort of thing. Fuji sees Buntaro come into the house, and he's asking for Mariko, and he's obviously annoyed that she's out and not in the house. And he kind of keeps making comments about living with the barbarian, and it's bad enough that she was. And there's a pretty good line in here, and he asks, what's it like to be a consort to a barbarian? And she says, I wouldn't know, I'm a consort to a Hatamoto. So it's a pretty good line. She's his niece, which I don't think I put that together. I'll be honest, I had a hard time the first couple episodes keeping track of all the names and people. But Fuji's been great this whole season when she's been in it. And this episode is really interesting because a lot of the stuff you get from the show this episode is just facial expressions. Like Mariko's reaction to seeing him, their facial reactions throughout the dinner conversations coming up. They do a great job. It's still crazy to me how much better Anna Sawai is in this show than she was in Monarch, where she felt like a piece of cardboard. This is a pretty good line too, where after he asks if he makes her pillow, she says the Anjin prefers the company of other women. Assuming that it was Mariko, it's interesting that she's kind of smirking because she knows that John prefers her. And obviously she can't tell Buntaro that. But the way that she says it implies that they're just bringing in prostitutes or consorts or courtesans or whatever. And I love this next part with Toranaga and Yabushige because Toranaga calls him out on everything, and Yabushige is getting really frustrated with Omi for not being able to figure out who the spy is in the village. So Toranaga's on top of it, and he kind of accuses him of manipulating his son, but he's also like, I know you're just going to keep playing both sides. So he's very aware of how much of a snake Yabushige is. Yabushige's got some really good expressions too. This is right after Toranaga accuses him of being the manipulator to stall going to Ishido and keep playing both sides. And he almost looks like a fucking emoji. It's so funny. He looks like the surprised emoji. And you can see Yabushige panicking after Toranaga says that his son's not that clever and just straight throws his nephew right under the bus. He's a really likable character for a complete scumbag. Maybe likable is the wrong word. Maybe more entertaining. And this is another great Toranaga scene where he talks the whole time to Yabushige like he's super pissed off that now they're going to war. And then at the end he goes, this is good for me. A siege on Osaka would have been a nightmare and we probably would have lost. This makes them come to us and we can just defend. So then he gives Omi command of the Anjin's artillery, or John's artillery. And Yabushige is like super pissed because he was trying to make sure that he didn't get blamed, and he ended up giving away credit for something he could have taken credit for. Absolutely deserved. It's so nice to see smart characters, and Toranaga has just been doing it all season so far. And Yabushige is bitching to Omi about finding the spy, and Omi's like, I can just give the artillery command to you. And Yabushige is like, it all belongs to me. And he's just kind of ranting and raving. It's interesting how much of all this conflict is just kind of like a perpetual battle for dominance and power, which to some extent I could imagine that it would be like this in the political world, especially a political world where your life is on the line if the politicians make bad decisions in a much more direct way than it is now, in America at least. Throughout the episode, you get glances of John's rotting pheasant with flies all over it, and they're all kind of bitching. And Fuji's talking about how unlucky her and Mariko are when it's just those two at dinner. She's unlucky that her husband's alive, and Fuji's unlucky that John is being weird about this pheasant. She calls him a tatarigami, which I had to look up. Apparently some kind of mythological Japanese spirit associated with calamity and disaster and those sorts of things, which is a really interesting way to foreshadow in this episode, because that's kind of how the episode ends. But I don't know if that's a reference that people would get unless they were really familiar with Japanese culture and had enough foresight to see that this was foreshadowing what was coming. I didn't see the earthquake coming at the end. I did think the pheasant was interesting because they keep referring to it as a calamity and a big deal. And this is one of those parts I was talking about is really good with letting the expressions communicate what's going on in the scene. Fuji says to Mariko, "You'd tell me if the Anjin was in danger, right?" And Mariko says, "Why would he be?" And then keeps eating, like, pretty casually. And then Fuji's just looking at her like, "Bitch, you know why." But it's just a really good way to show it without her expressly saying, "Because you pillared the barbarian." And they have a whole conversation about it. She gives her this look like, "You're crazy." And everybody understands immediately what she's getting at. And you can see a lot of these little things in the visuals where they're standing very close to each other and they used to stand much further apart. But John's kind of freaking out because he's like, "What am I supposed to do?" And Mariko's like, "Get ready for dinner and be a good host." Like, kind of just stay out of the way. And this is a nice little part. We don't get much time with Warijo. I'm butchering that name, I'm sure. He's talking about the garden and how it needs rocks, and he's just kind of doing his thing around the house. So when he ends up dying at the end of the episode, you're like, shit, but this nice little old man got killed. Even though we don't know a ton about him, they do enough to make the effect on John substantial. And we get a nice little thing here where Buntaro and John meet, and John's just on the formalities of he's glad that he's here. Buntaro says that his bow would beat a cannon, and John's like, "Oh, maybe we should have a friendly match sometime." So I assume at some point John's just going to fucking shoot him. This dinner scene lasts for quite a few minutes, and it just gradually goes from funny to awkward to really intense by the end. It's really well done. Because at first, John made stew out of the pheasant, and they're all kind of making faces, and he calls it English rabbit stew. You can kind of see them all like holding their noses, and they really think it's disgusting. And then no one ends up eating except for John. It's just another one of those nice little reminders that he's in another world for all intents and purposes, that they won't even eat his food or try his food. Buntaro keeps calling John a baby monkey or a monkey, and John's like, "What's he saying?" And Mariko explains that you're supposed to slurp your food, and then Buntaro does it, and then John does it super loudly, and he's like, "Oh, the monkey learns tricks quickly." And we had this thing that starts out funny that just slowly edges into like a machismo contest that ends up being like kind of disastrous, which is really interesting. And I think it's a pretty good portrayal of how shit can just slowly escalate, especially when there's alcohol involved and you have guys just being idiots, which they're known to do from time to time. So John gets a little bit annoyed and throws the sake out of the little baby cup and then uses his bowl to chug it. And then Buntaro does it and they start going back and forth. And obviously they both get pretty drunk. And Mariko and Fuji are like, "We should probably cut them off or get them to go to bed." And Fuji's like, "Tell him that we ran out of sake." John asks for Mariko's husband to share his story of how he escaped. And he kind of gets pissy. And he's like, "Why doesn't he tell us one of his stories?" And John's like, no, I want to hear it. And he starts kind of pushing him in Japanese. So he gets pissed off and says, "Give me my bow." And then right post or left post. And John says, "Right." So he shoots 2 arrows like an inch in front of Mariko's face. And John's freaking out like, "You should move and not be that close. He might kill you." And this is one of those things about women just being property and men can just do what they want with them. So she has to sit there because her husband said so. And then John gets kind of defensive and he's like, "I understand that women are property just like in my country, but you should still probably treat her better." Buntaro's being a belligerent drunk. And he's like, "Tell him your name and tell him your backstory." And John's saying in Portuguese, like, "You don't have to do this. Just make something up. He won't know the difference." But she goes ahead and tells her backstory anyway, finally, so we know what's going on with her. So what we find out is that her dad worked for the previous ruler of the realm before the Taiko. And because that ruler was so crazy and corrupt, her dad killed him. And then as punishment, they gathered up her entire family and her dad had to behead each one of them one at a time and then commit seppuku himself. And she got out of it because she was married to Buntaro. So obviously her backstory is just brutal. And you can see why she gets frustrated with John for not understanding how their stuff works. And she says that every year on the anniversary, she wants to fight because she wasn't allowed to. And Buntaro orders her to keep living. So she views it as being trapped and suffering because she can't go for revenge or die. And it seems like Buntaro believes he's doing her a favor by making her live her life. And this whole dinner scene is acted wonderfully. Like Buntaro just looks like an asshole. He looks mean. John, his emotions are all over the place, obviously, as he's going from kind of fun to drunk to pissed off to sympathetic. Mariko's pretty stressed out the whole time and has to give her super depressing backstory. And Fuji communicates most of her stuff just with reactions. It's just a really well done scene. And it's really intense the whole time you're watching it. Good job for them. So Buntaro in his drunken state beats the shit out of Mariko. John hears it and grabs his gun and goes to get him, and he's really pissed off, obviously. And this is all about shame and dishonor and that sort of thing. And Fuji says that by disturbing the house, Mariko and Buntaro have dishonored the Anjin. And Mariko says, what's there to dishonor? This place is cursed. So it seems like they're really hung up on this pheasant thing. When John gets to Buntaro finally, he's like, get up, coward. And he's super pissed off and he's screaming at him. And he just apologizes and says that he disturbed the harmony of his house. And he pulls his swords out and puts his head down. And John just leaves him there. You knew there'd be an explosion between these two because of how they've been the whole time and then the stuff with Mariko. I wasn't expecting it to go this direction, but it was still really well done and I really enjoyed it. I'm kind of curious to see how they fully wrap it up between these two, because this episode really focused a lot on this little group. We see Toranaga with Nagakado and Miraji, and we know that Miraji is the spy and that Yagushibe is really wanting to find the spy, and Toranaga's like, then you better find someone else to be the spy, essentially. So again, he's just constantly making moves, constantly thinking ahead, and he's kind of always got the drop on his enemies. And you can see they keep getting more and more worked up about this dead pheasant, and John's like, yeah, I don't care, where's Mariko? And he can't understand him because she can't translate for him, so he just leaves. John goes and finds Mariko, and she tells him, we're not going to talk anymore except for translations. Because he's getting really pissed off, and he's like, you know, you're living your life for all these other people. You should have some of it for yourself. And she's like, these rituals and customs are important, and that's how shit is. We live, we die. We're going to do what we need to. If you're a Western person, you're probably on John's side. That like traditions and stuff can be important depending on context. I'm not somebody who thinks everything traditional is just stupid. You still have to have some regard for yourself and your own life. And to me, this is really where you can see the individualistic, classically liberal nature of the English clashing with the collectivist nature of the Japanese. And this is something that, to my understanding, is prevalent in Japan even today. Obviously, they're not committing seppuku and that sort of thing, but that mentality is still there, is how it seems to me. While in the Western world, we're much more individualistic, sometimes too much. John goes back, and everybody looks super upset, and he's like, what's going on? And Fuji points to the bird, and John's like, oh, yeah, I was up there long enough. And then he asks who did it, and she says, Orijuru, whose name I still can't pronounce. And he's like, oh, good for him. He should get a medal for being able to get up there. And then she says he's dead because he touched the bird. And John said, if you touch it, die. Because he's the lord of the house. That's what they did. And this is kind of the breaking point for him where he's like, it was a dead, rotting bird. What the fuck is wrong with all of you? And he's had so many of these moments throughout the show. But I think this one feels weirdly personal because it was his words that got Orijiro killed. So I think it really resonates with him more than the other ones where he can kind of blame them all for being crazy. He feels responsible. Fuji says it's her fault and he needs to take her life. And he's like, Jesus Christ, what's wrong with all of you? And he just starts screaming like, go away, get away, go away from me. And Cosmo Jarvis, who's the guy that plays John, killed this episode. He was awesome. And if that's his real name and not just a stage name, that's a pretty baller name, so good for him. So now that he's like completely snapped, he goes to Toranaga and he's like, I feel like I've fulfilled my end of the bargain. I want to leave Japan forever. I'm never coming back to this place because you're insane. And Toranaga's like, there's a shadow over you two. And Mariko explains that Orijiro is dead. And Toranaga's like, he needs to just stop being a child and walks off. And they just have complete disregard for the value of individual life. Just throughout the show, I'm assuming throughout their history. And it's just driving John crazy. And he can't stop blaming himself now. There's a big ass earthquake. And a bunch of people get sucked under in these landslides, including Toranaga. Luckily, John is able to find him, and Toranaga's freaking out about his swords being buried, so John gives him his. And John just always has a knack for being in the right place at the right time, it seems. And they stand up, and the armory's just like, see ya. And this definitely feels like the false low point for the story. Toranaga's on his own now. John's at a low point, obviously, for himself. Him and Mariko aren't talking. Everything is just a mess. And you can see the village was also destroyed. And we can see John went back to his house and found Fuji, and he's glad she's okay. And obviously this is much different from how many men value women in their society. Toranaga actually has a line to Mariko right before this where he's like, Buntaro can do what he wants with his property, but I can't have my translator hurt or non-functioning or whatever. And we see that Toranaga's spy tricks Yabushige here by planting some evidence that this guy who died, presumably in the earthquake, is a spy. Or he used the earthquake to kill the guy, we don't know. But either way, it looks like he's in the clear for now, to not be caught as the spy. And we end the episode with Lady Oichiro saying that because the heir's life is in danger and they're busy politicking, that now they can answer to her so she can get shit done. And kind of a power grab for her, it seems like, to become Queen Taiko or whatever. I don't know what the titles are. Empress. So yeah, this was a really good episode. They fit a ton of stuff in. The dinner scene might be my favorite scene from the whole show. It was just so well done where they're casually drinking and having fun, and it just slowly gets more and more tense until obviously it explodes with Buntaro beating the shit out of Mariko and John wanting to kill him. And everything with John like refusing to blend into their culture and the gardener dying because of it. Toranaga's scheming even though he doesn't have much screen time. Obviously we get to see Yabushige being frustrated because he's just being outplayed all the time. Yeah, this was so good. I'm really looking forward to the second half of this season. I definitely envy anybody who doesn't find out about this show until like episode 9 or after the season's over and they can just binge it. Because these week-to-week waits are brutal. Unlike the Halo ones, which just seem to come one after the other, and the misery is just never ending. Alright, that's it for me for this one. I don't want to go too long. If you watch this episode, let me know what you think. I'll respond. I've been getting some really helpful comments about stuff that I've missed or didn't understand the full context for. People providing context from the books. I really appreciate all that. Because I'm not going to catch everything. I mean, I just watch these shows after work like everybody else. Yeah, so thanks for the help. I try to respond to all the comments that aren't just insults. Like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.